A very warm welcome to this presentation, which explores the relationship between Elizabeth I and Nonsuch Palace in Surrey. The presentation started out as a short talk on the connection between Elizabeth I and the Royal Palace, which I believe has some relevance to a painting which hangs in Hampton Court Palace. I called this the pregnancy portrait and was the subject of my presentation in 2018. Do have a look at it, as this is a very beautiful and mysterious painting. As I researched the subject, I became fascinated by the palace itself and its history, so I've divided the presentation into two. Part 1 is about the palace and those who built and used it, including Elizabeth. Part 2 is about some very special features of the garden which relate to the pregnancy portrait. Sadly, the building no longer exists, and details were known to only a few by way of a couple of paintings and some written descriptions of those who had visited it. So let me take you on a journey. In the late 1530s, Henry VIII planned a great hunting estate containing a palace which linked with Hampton Court, so that as he grew older and more infirm, he wouldn't have to undergo the discomfort of long journeys on horseback to indulge his favourite sport. Above all else, it was a vanity project, the aim being to produce a palace to rival anything in Europe, in particular the Palace of Fontainebleau, which was being built at the same time. He built it to celebrate the birth of his son Edward VI on the 21st of December 1537. It was to become an emblem for the Tudor dynasty, an earthly link between Henry the man and Henry close to deity in his role as head of the church. Here is a map of Surrey from that period. The city of London is in the top right-hand corner. Hampton Court can be seen at the bend of the river. To the south-east can be seen the village of Ewell. Henry chose the nearby manor of Cuddington at the foot of the North Downs. Both the clean air from the downs and the abundant water supply nearby made the site attractive. The owners of the local manor house were evicted, and the village, including the church, was razed to the ground. The nearby Merton Priory was suppressed a week before building began, dismantled, and the stones later used to build the foundations of the new building. This satellite image shows the geography more clearly. In total, Henry gained 2,000 acres of land by linking the two sites. On the site of Cuddington was built a royal palace, so splendid that no other place could match it. It was called Nonsuch. It was to have no equal. Work started on the palace on the 22nd of April 1538, when an army of workmen started totally clearing the site. The building work took about 9 years, employed an estimated 500 workmen, and after just 7 years had cost around £24,000. That's 10 million at today's prices. This was much more than Hampton Court Palace, which cost approximately £16,000 and was about 3 times the size of Nonsuch. Our knowledge of the palace comes from a number of sources. Firstly, the written accounts of several visitors during the 16th and 17th centuries, among them Anthony Watson, the rector of Cheam, writing in the 1580s, William Camden in 1586, Paul Henzer in 1598, and Thomas Platter in 1599. We shall hear descriptions from each of them later. Secondly, were paintings and engravings of the building. This is an engraving by Joris Hoefnagel, made of an earlier painting. It shows the south face of the building. The view is somewhat obscured by the high wall which surrounded the palace. This is a map of Surrey drawn by John Speed in 1627. In the top right-hand corner is that the drawing of Nonsuch. It is more of a cartographer's impression than an artistic one. Again, the building is being viewed from the south. This is a view from the north of the palace by an unknown Flemish artist from the early 17th century. The third source of information was surviving documents, such as an inventory of the building and the gardens in 1590. These are artists' impressions derived from sketches of some of the ornaments and statues within the palace gardens. Fourthly, was the result of a large-scale excavation in 1959 organised by John Dent, a local librarian, which established the plan and exact dimensions of the site. This was a huge undertaking. The aerial view is looking west across the excavation towards Cherry Orchard Farm. This represents one half of the palace in the foreground, the other half being under the trees and the farm shown in the distance. Here I have superimposed the visible half to give you a better impression of the footprint of the whole building. As you can see from the pictures, the work attracted considerable public interest. The lower image was taken on the last day of the excavation before the ground was restored to protect the remains. The fifth source of information about the building came from the construction of the magnificent model of the building by Professor Martin Biddle and his team. Professor Biddle dedicated 50 years of his life to unravel the mysteries of the palace. So let's start by looking at the palace and the privy garden when it was in its completed state. The most likely candidate for the design of the palace is the king himself, aided by those who proposed solutions to the themes he wished to see expressed, or who refined and added to the proposals he had made. Unfortunately, he died before it was completed, so the project was worked on over many years by Henry FitzAlan, the 12th Earl of Arundel. He in turn died in 1580, and the palace was taken on by his son-in-law Sir John Lumley before returning it to the crown in 1592. The palace was approached by a long avenue of alternating elm and walnut trees. Interestingly, in this painting the sky is filled with red kites, a common sight in Tudor England. Here is a ground plan based on the 1959 excavations. The building was relatively small, only 330 feet long by 165 feet wide. That's less than a football pitch, and it consisted of two rectangles joined together. There was an opening at one end and in the middle. The site of the pre-existing church at Cuddington can be seen, and on the eastern side of the building was the kitchen block. The main gatehouse on the north front gave the appearance of a fortified castle. There were 4 octagonal turrets, one at each corner, rising high above the battlemented walls. The lower walls were windowless. This was the power and magnificence of the king set in stone. Directly in front of this there was a bowling green, as you can see from the painting. An archway opened on to the outer courtyard. The roof of the archway was shaped in such a way to greatly amplify the sound of those approaching, the aim being to create a dramatic musical entrance as the king arrived. Above the entrance on the inside was a huge sundial with the signs of the zodiac and the figure of Father Time. The rooms around this courtyard were for the palace staff, but such was the monarch's retinue that when the court arrived, many were housed in tents pitched by the entrance of the avenue, close to the bowling green. Crossing the courtyard, the visitor mounted 8 steps, perhaps signifying the rise of the monarchy to 8 Henrys. passing through the opposite wing under the inner gatehouse, gave entry to the inner court. The sight which greeted the visitor here was magnificent, unlike anything in the world. The lower walls were of stone on all four sides. Above this, the walls were covered with near life-size stucco reliefs in gleaming white, each one surrounded by a carved slate frame covered in gold leaf. The courtyard was adorned with fountains, statuary and carvings. There was a king's side, which was on the right, that was west, and the queen's side on the left. The stucco reliefs were in 3 tiers. Around the top of the courtyard were 30 three-quarter life stucco sculptures of Roman emperors, from Julius Caesar to Aemilianus. In the middle tier, the king's side had 16 gods, and the queen's side 16 goddesses. Below these, the king's side was the life of Hercules from the cradle to his death on Mount Oeta. On the queen's, the personification of the liberal arts and values. The figures were identified with mottos written in letters of gilded lead. This is the centre of the south wall of the inner court as represented in the Nonsuch model. The queen's side and the king's side are shown to the left and right. At the top is the row of Roman rulers. Below this are the gods, and at the bottom are the labours of Hercules. Right in the middle were vast figures of Henry VIII and his son Edward. Henry was setting himself up among the gods, an apotheosis. By being head of the church, he had been elevated to divine status. The figures of the inner court were also there to instruct Edward in the qualities required of a Renaissance prince. At intervals along the walls were mottos including "Know thyself." The effect of the combination of the blinding white of the stuccos and the gold of the frames was as though the courtyard was ablaze. The gatehouse into the rear courtyard was far more elaborate than the one at the northern end of the building. It was the centre of the palace and its highest point. It had 4 crenellated octagonal towers and 3 oriel windows on curved corbels. These were like bay windows which did not actually reach the ground. Above this was a magnificent sundial facing due south. On top of the tower was a clock and weather vanes. This in turn was surmounted by a belfry supported by pillars and a delicate cupola. At the corners of the ledges above and below the clock and around each of the south towers, holding aloft the weather vanes, were the statues of the king's beasts. These were the mythical creatures which supported his coat of arms, of which the king had at least 9. The crowning glory of the whole building was the south face. There were 2 vast octagonal towers rising to 5 stories high and getting wider as they went up, both being surmounted by a cupola. The entire south face, including the towers, was covered in relief statues. This watercolour was painted by Hofnagel in 1582 to celebrate the arrival of the Queen. The decorative scheme was thus more than 900 feet in length, with a minimum average height of 24 feet. It therefore covered a surface of some 21,600 square feet, just under a third of a football pitch. The number of panels has been estimated at around 700. This watercolour is by the same artist and is dated 1562. The figures can clearly be seen on some of the panels. The entire inner court was wood framed, including the huge towers. The trees used to construct them were so large that they proved extremely hard to transport. The court was roofed in slate, and in addition to the king and queen's apartments, there was a dining hall, a chapel, and a long gallery between the two towers. The building accounts for the early part of the work still exist and reveal that German water engineers, French clockmakers and a Dutch carver were employed. It's interesting to look more closely at the illustrated panels. They were especially designed for exterior use, hence the term stucco d'oro. They were constructed in high relief, alto rilievo. There neither is nor has been any other building in the world which had adornment of this type or magnitude. Here are some fragments of stucco panels uncovered from Nonsuch. The technique for making the figures involved adding water to a mixture of pulverized burnt chalk and burnt flint. It's set as hard as stone. A wooden backing was added to the spaces between the timbers of the walls, and the relief built up using the wet plaster, which was worked by hand or tools. This had to be done at speed before it set, as it could not be easily altered afterwards. Wooden pegs were used to support the thickest sections. Carving the slate frames was extremely skilled because of the tendency for it to split. The designs on both the stucco and the slate included flowers and fruit, Tudor roses, flaming torches and crowns. The detailing, as you can see, is extraordinary. 24 men under the guidance of a William Kendall were responsible for the stucco work. The overall designer was Nicholas Bellin of Modena. He had been working at Fontainebleau for Francis I of France, and this is the sort of work that he'd been engaged in. It adorns the main staircase of the palace. Bellin had left France to work for Henry VIII, causing considerable friction between the two kings. It is thought that he drew sketches of the panels which were copied by the workmen. During the work he kept in touch with those still working at Fontainebleau to keep abreast with new techniques. The subject of the panels on the south wall and its towers are not entirely clear, but among them seem to have been scenes from Ovid's Metamorphoses. The Roman poet recorded his vision of the history of the world from Adam to Roman times poetically in a series of 15 books made up of 250 scenes drawn from mythology, and each demonstrated some sort of physical change in the characters. I will come back to this in some more detail later. What we can see from Hufnagel's painting is a series of figures, apparently fighting, on horseback or reclining. Being mostly unclothed, it is reasonable to infer that they illustrate a story of ancient times. There is one rather shadowy figure which appears to be seated. Below the site of this, the western tower fragments of a panel were unearthed in 1959. These fragments clearly show part of a soldier with a shield. And here is an artist's impression of what the original panel may have looked like. Now let's look at the privy garden. Once more, the palace is viewed from the south. On the eastern side, as we have seen, were the kitchens built alongside the main structure. The palace was set in the privy garden, which wrapped around it on 3 sides. This in turn had a 14-foot brick wall enclosing the space. The gardens were set out in an Italianate manner, probably after 1580. The emphasis was on symmetry. Fruit trees, including apricot, were grown along the walls. They were specially imported from France, as were pippins, which had never previously been grown in England. There were galleries of trees with seating, and in the open spaces and beds were intricate patterns or knots, edged with thorn and gravel. Stone statues of small animals were scattered amongst them. Aromatic plants were used frequently, particularly in the designs in front of the south face of the palace. the Queen looking down from her windows would have been met not only by the sight but also the aroma of the garden. The drama of the Privy Garden was produced by a series of fountains. In the centre stood a statue of Diana, standing on a mound with water spouting from her breasts. This was flanked by two statues on tall columns. They were known as the falcon perches, but as we shall see, the birds were not falcons. This is the Diana fountain, denoted by the moon above her head. It stood on a grassy mound. Note that there appears to be a bench within the fountain, which does suggest that guests would sit with their feet in the water, which had cascaded down from above. Here is a view from the southwest. The feature on the left was called the Great Pinnacle. The feature on the right of the western tower was a table fountain. Here are close-ups of the three features, engravings of which were found in the 1590 inventory: the obelisk, one of the falcon perches, and the table fountain. In fact, the bird at the top of the falcon perch and the three on the table were all parrots, as featured on the coat of arms of John Lumley. The birds can also be seen at the base of the obelisk. Here is another fountain, which was also described to have been close to the south tower. This was termed the Pelican Fountain and apparently stood on a marble table. This is the coat of arms of the Earls of Scarborough, the descendants of the Lumleys. Above is a pelican, and below three parrots or popinjays, supported by two more. This remarkable engraving was done by H.W. Brewer in 1894. Along the bottom of the engraving he describes a number of features: the clock tower, the yew trees in the foreground, the great pinnacle, which seems to have an Egyptian style, the water tower, which is actually the western tower, the falcon perches, and the marble fountain, which he calls the washbowl. This seems to be some variation of the Pelican Fountain. The level of detail is extraordinary and suggests that it may have been drawn from a now lost painting or engraving. After all, the building had not existed for 200 years. Although it may not be entirely accurate, I think it can serve to give an impression of what it must have been like standing in the Privy Garden looking up at the building. This is a view of the western side of the palace. There was an orchard and a maze. This concept too had been introduced from Renaissance Europe and was an extension of the knot garden. The hedges were often planted with aromatic plants to enhance the pleasure. Anthony Watson said of the Nonsuch maze, "If you veer to the right you will fall into the hazardous wiles of the labyrinth, whence even with the aid of Theseus's thread you will be scarce able to extricate yourself." This is a reference to the Greek myth of Theseus using a thread to find his way out of a maze after killing the Minotaur. By 1599, Thomas Platter wrote that the hedges of Nonsuch were so high and thick that you could neither see over nor through them. So now we have a good idea of how the palace looked in all its splendour. Let's trace its history. Nonsuch was sold to Henry Fitzalan Lord Arundel and Lord Chamberlain to Henry VIII in 1555 by Queen Mary I. This was in exchange for some cash and some estates in Suffolk, and indeed in thanks for his help in gaining the throne from Lady Jane Grey in 1553. In 1559 the Queen attended the housewarming party, following intense activity and completion and embellishment. The visit was one of the most colourful events in the history of the palace. Arundel was twice widowed and 48, and the Queen was 26. His entertainment of her was the talk of the town, and it was quite obvious what he was up to. She remained from the 5th of August until the 10th of August. There was great feasting and banquets every night. There was a masque and drums, flutes and all music that could be. The final banquet ended at 3:30 in the morning. If Arundel was hoping for the Queen's romantic attention, he was sorely disappointed and wasted a huge amount of money in the process. This was topped by a cupboard full of gold and plate gifted to her on her departure. During the ensuing years, Arundel completed much of the work left unfinished by King Henry. He installed a magnificent triple-columned fountain in the centre of the inner court. This was topped by the Fitzalan White Horse, below which were 3 dancing graces, supported at the bottom by 2 griffins. He added cupolas to the tops of the towers. He also completed the central gatehouse by adding a clock tower and the large onion dome resting on columns, in between which was suspended the concord of bells, the mechanism of which was powered by water. The ability to power the multiple fountains and other features on the site without the use of pumps and recycling proved a great challenge. To understand how they did it, we need to look first at the geology of the area. The only technology available to Tudor builders was borrowed from the Romans, in other words, pipes and gravity. Here is a north-south geological cross-section through Kent. The rock strata have been pushed up and then eroded over time. The key features for our purposes are 2 rows of hills, the North Downs and the South Downs, which were made of chalk, which is of course very porous. This in turn stood on impermeable clay. Nonsuch stood close to the North Downs, which provided a ready and plentiful supply of water which ran down inside the hills to emerge as springs. Water was collected from high up in the hills and then moved by pipework to a lead reservoir at the top of this, the western tower. Gravity did the rest. Considering that the tower was made of wood, this appears to have been quite a bold concept, particularly in terms of how to cope when the tank was full to overflowing. The calculations on the diameter of the pipes to serve all the features must have been difficult, particularly as the flow of water would not have been constant during the seasons. It may well have been that the fountains were active only on special occasions and for a limited time. There was no water recycling, of course, so it all had to be ducted away from the site. We know that Arundel owned 3 volumes of the Venice edition of Ovid's Metamorphoses, printed in Latin in 1515 and 16. There was no English edition until 1567. It is said that the interior of Nonsuch was decorated with a collection of sculptures representing stories from Metamorphoses, in addition to those on the external panels. Over the years, Arundel's relationship with Elizabeth proved difficult as she began to increase the time she spent at Nonsuch. Perhaps because of her rejection, Arundel began plotting with Catholics at home and abroad to oust her from her throne and replace her with Catherine Grey, the sister of Jane. He was punished by confinement at the palace for 12 months. In 1571 he was at it again, this time with an Italian called Ridolfi. The plan this time was to put Mary Queen of Scots on the throne by marrying her off to the Duke of Norfolk and returning the country to Catholicism. Once more he was put under house arrest. Oddly, he kept his head. Perhaps he was more useful in continuing to invest in the palace. Elizabeth had a history of getting people to fritter away their fortunes in hope of favour. Then there was the debt. He had unwisely taken on a debt owed by the city of Florence to the Queen. This, together with his extravagance, left him more than £1 million adrift in today's money when he died in 1580. Lord Lumley, Arundel's son-in-law, took on responsibility for the palace. Faced with an unpayable debt, he continued to spend. He built up a splendid library and created the first Italianate garden in England. Indeed, it was he who commissioned the fountains, the obelisk, and the falcon statues. He was also responsible for some of other fascinating developments which I will come to later. By 1590, Sir John was getting desperate to raise money, and so drew up a huge inventory of his belongings to see what he could sell. This has been preserved and is referred to as the Red Velvet Book. It has revealed a treasure trove of old masters and drawings of all the fountains and statues. The library was later to become part of the British Library, and it was the second largest in private hands. Sir John's solution was that the palace should be transferred to the Queen, together with the expense of it, keeping it up, and he would stay on as a keeper, a role he fulfilled until 1606. If he was planning a quiet life, he was in for a shock. In 1592, ownership of the palace and estates was duly made over to the Queen. There was no doubt that Elizabeth loved Nonsuch, and she spent a considerable sum on refurbishment and was to spend every summer there later in her reign. Privy Council meetings took place regularly, as well as visits by the entire court. She attended with 300 carts of baggage, including tapestries from Hampton Court, which were used to cover the plain walls. It is important to remember that the royal palaces spent most of their time in hibernation, with only a skeleton staff. The monarch and court brought their luxury with them, wherever they went. By 1599, a letter from Rowland White to Sir Robert Sidney stated about Nonsuch, which of all other places she likes the best. Here are a couple of examples of life with Elizabeth at Nonsuch. On the 23rd of September 1599, a Thomas Platter from Switzerland had the honour of attending matins and lunch with the Queen. Between 12 and 1 o'clock, men with white staffs came in, followed by lords of high standing, and then the Queen. Although Platter says she was 74, actually she was only 66, she looked no more than 20, standing erect and regal in a white satin dress embroidered with gold. Her headdress was a whole bird of paradise. Her red hair was studded with jewels. She wore a long necklace of large pearls and rings on her fingers. Elizabeth sat on a cushion, flanked on her left by her gentleman and on her right by her secretary and a splendidly arrayed lady-in-waiting. Then a knight on bended knee offered her books, from which she read, after which the Archbishop of Canterbury, wearing a white surplice, turned to face her and preached his sermon, with responses at the beginning and at the end, just as in the Roman Church. When she'd had enough of the heat and the crowd, Elizabeth signed for the sermon to end and withdrew to her private room. And then what to our eyes would be an extraordinary charade took place, the serving of luncheon in the presence chamber to an absent majesty. but it was as much for security as for ceremony, and each detail was strictly or fairly strictly adhered to. First, guards in red tabards embroidered in gold with the royal arms carried in 2 trestle tables and put them near where the Queen had been sitting. 2 more guards, carrying maces, next entered and bowed, advanced and bowed, reached the table and bowed. They laid the table and withdrew. Then another 2 guards, also bowing, put plates on the table and withdrew. A third couple entered in the same way and put carving knives, bread and salt on the table, which was now considered ready. At last 3 gentlemen, 2 of them carrying maces, and a charming lady in waiting, all bowing, came and stood in front of the table to wait for the food. There then ensued a procession of about 40 guardsmen, each carrying a dish of food, which he presented to the lady in waiting. She cut off a piece of food for each guardsman to taste in case it was poisoned. But here Platter noticed security was slipping, because several of the men didn't bother to eat their morsel. When the carving was finished, wine and beer were brought in and tasted. The dishes of food were offered to the Queen in her private apartment. For this very hot day, the light lunch included some very large joints of beef and all kinds of game, pasties and tarts. Dessert followed, accompanied by music from trumpets and shawms. Then the whole ceremony was reversed. When complete, Mr. Platter and his friends went to a tent before the palace and took his luncheon there. On the 28th of September, 1599, occurred the event which has kept alive the name of Nonsuch through the long years of neglect, for on this day the palace was the setting of one of the dramas of national history, one which would have brought about a fundamental change of the monarchy, a visit from Robert Devereux. This is he, 2nd Earl of Essex, Lieutenant and Governor-General of Ireland, and favourite of Elizabeth. He was ambitious, temperamental, and unpredictable. Elizabeth's reign was coming to an end, and Devereux was in open conflict with the Queen's First Minister, Robert Cecil. Both Robert and his father William, who was Lord Burleigh, had ruthlessly impoverished the gentry, and he wished to continue under the next monarch, whoever that might be. Essex had further reason to be resentful of the Queen, as his father had lost both his wealth and his health, having to self-fund attempts to suppress the Irish. So much for the background. Essex, like his father, was sent to Ireland, at least partly to get him out of the way while Robert Cecil manoeuvred for power. He was ordered to proceed against the rebel Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone. They met on the 7th of September, and instead of carrying on as instructed to engage battle, he arranged a truce. The Queen wrote rejecting the action, and Essex set off for London with a large company. He had half-formed ideas of a coup d'etat, which dwindled as he neared London. Most of the party dispersed, and Essex proceeded to Nonsuch with just 6 men. On arrival, he burst into the privy chamber, muddy and unkempt, and then into the Queen's bedroom at 10 a.m. Initially, she appeared to take the intrusion in good part, although the incident further reduced the reputation of her erstwhile favourite. She had been dressing with her face unpainted and without her wig. As she was used to being seen with her personal charms greatly enhanced, she must have been very angry indeed. After a short talk, she sent him away to change. A further meeting took place at 12 noon, which appeared to have gone well. Within an hour, Robert Cecil explained his version of the treacherous plans with which Essex had left Ireland. It has to be said that this was just part of the long-standing struggle for Cecil to retain power after Elizabeth died by supporting James VI of Scotland. Later in the evening the Queen met once more with Essex. Being dissatisfied with his explanation, she referred him to the full council, which met the next day, and as a result Essex was imprisoned for a year in his own house. After release he continued to plot against her, culminating in an unsuccessful uprising, leading to his trial and execution in 1601. The heavy use of Nonsuch resulted in much reparative work, and during the last 3 years of her reign the Queen spent a great deal of time there. She was out riding and hunting every day. If some important matter arose, she rode to the nearest house for a council meeting. One of the local houses acquired the name of the Council House and later Whitehall. The house in Cheam still exists today. There is a story that as the Queen was returning from hunting, she saw the reflection of the sun in the windows of Nonsuch, and she thought that the building was on fire. She was so put out by the mistake that she moved to Richmond, and that is where she died on the 24th of March, 1603. The palace was used regularly by both James I and Charles I. It gradually decayed, but managed to survive the Civil War and the ensuing Republic. It was not so lucky when Barbara Villiers entered the story. Queen Henrietta Maria, the wife of Charles I, died in 1669, and her son Charles II decided to pay off one of his former mistresses, Barbara Villiers, Duchess of Cleveland, by making Nonsuch over to her. Late one July night in Paris, 9 years later, Barbara Villiers, now Baroness Nonsuch, gambled away £20,000, a present value of more than £1 million, and most of her jewellery in one fell swoop. The king refused to reimburse her, so her thoughts turned to Nonsuch, which she regarded as an expensive white elephant. Its only value to her lay in the building materials, so she set to work to destroy it. She made £1,800 on the deal, worth about £100,000 today. When Nonsuch was demolished, the stucco panels were broken up. Most of the fragments are taken away, but the excavations of 1959 unearthed 1,500, from which it was possible to reconstruct the single panel we saw earlier. Today, virtually nothing remains except parkland. If it were not for the splendid work of many people, this is how it would have remained. The archaeological work recorded by John Dent in his 1970 book, The Quest for Nonsuch, uncovered many treasures and confirmed the dimension of the building. His daughter Lalage Lister published a book, Nonsuch, Pearl of the Realm, in 1992, which brought the story to a wider public. As I've told you, Professor Martin Biddle devoted 50 years of his life unravelling the mysteries of the palace, leading to the stunning model of the building which can be viewed at Nonsuch Park Mansion. There is now nothing to see above ground. Even the results of the excavations have been buried to preserve them. This photograph shows the approach to Nonsuch today, looking due south. Here is one of the walnut trees alongside the path. The stone pillar marks the site of the outer gatepost. The mown area on the left marks out the eastern side of the palace. The western side on the right was under Cherry Orchard Farm and was never excavated. The second stone marks the inner gatehouse. There is a slight rise in the land where the 8 steps to the inner court were located. The third marker, indicated the south wall of the palace, can just be seen. This is the view due north, looking back from the third marker along the entire length of the palace site. The 2 arrows indicate the 2 previous markers. This is looking south across what was the privy garden. the land rises to the site of the palace wall. Just behind the trees is the fourth marker post, which indicates the site of the perimeter wall of the privy garden. Here is the wall marker viewed looking due west along the line of where the wall would have been. This is the view across Nonsuch Park, the royal hunting ground. It gives the impression that nothing has changed in the last 400 years. So this is the end of the first part of Elizabeth and Nonsuch. As I said at the beginning, it was not part of my plan to present a section on the palace itself, but it seemed too good an opportunity to miss. I do hope by this stage you can appreciate the building itself and the attachment which Elizabeth had to it. This, however, is not the whole story. There is another fascinating aspect to Nonsuch and Elizabeth, and this concerns another part of the garden, which I believe may have relevance to the Hampton Court Palace portrait of Elizabeth. I'd like to thank the Friends of Nonsuch for permission to use images of their wonderful model of the palace. It is housed in Nonsuch Mansion House and is usually open on Sunday afternoons. Do go and see it if you can when it reopens after COVID restrictions are lifted. I would also like to thank Stephen Conlin from Picture Limited for permission to use his lovely illustration of the palace. I hope you agree that both of these items greatly enhanced the presentation. Thank you very much for joining me, and please look out for part 2.